Hi, welcome to the second day of the Women and Silent Screen 2021. The title of our panel is Global and Local, Silent Era Chinese Film Production for International Export. My name is Yan-fei Song. I am the chair of this panel. I was a visiting scholar at Columbia University, and I am currently a PhD student at Beijing Normal University, major in film, television, and media studies. This panel will run for about 1.5 hours with 2 presentations and 1 discussion. Sadly enough, that due to health issues, Professor Daoxin cannot make it, but he sent his sincere apology for missing our panel. Even though Professor Li cannot join us, we still have 2 excellent experts on silent era Chinese films. We have Xuelei Huang from University of Edinburgh and Professor Yongchun from Ningbo Institute of Technology, Zhejiang University. If you are interested in their biology, please go to the official website of Women and the Silent Screen 2021. Please note that due to the form of this event, we will not be able to take questions from the audience. Finally, I want to express my greatest gratitude to the team of Women and the Silent Screen 2021 and Professor Gintz, who worked so hard to make this happen. Now, let's welcome Xuelei Huang from University of Edinburgh.
Thank you very much, Yan-fei. You put tremendous time to put this event together, and yeah, I'm really grateful, and also many thanks to Professor Jane Gaines and BAM and the whole team. It's really so important we still have such event during the global pandemic, and I'm very proud to be part of it. Okay, let's get started. Oh, somehow, Ben, can you give me access to share the screen? Somehow it said host disabled participation screen sharing. Was there anything?
You should have access now.
Ah, yeah. Somehow it's strange. The PPT doesn't show up. It's always a little bit, let me. Only whiteboard.
We had that problem before.
Let me restart my PowerPoint and then try again. Still. Sorry about that. Digital time have problem. Let me restart.
Yeah, we had a snafu yesterday in a conference last month. We had only whiteboards to start over again.
All right. We have it. Okay, oh, sorry. All right, the title of my presentation is The Queer Woman in Chinese Cinema. It's mainly about Yan-fei, a film actress, and actually she's also a film producer. And I mainly want to critique gender politics in star culture in the 1920s and 30s China, also against a transnational geographical background. So let me first start with a familiar discourse, that is the new woman concept. And I would like to take issue with this dominant concept with my case study. As you know, the new woman is almost a signpost of Chinese modernity. Emerging in the 1910s, male intellectuals invested this figure with particular social aspirations, creating them as a part of a nationalist project. However, in the 1920s and the 30s, the fall of the new woman became dominant in the popular discourse. An embodiment of this type of fallen new woman in Chinese cinema is the phenomenal star Ran Lingyu, as you can see from this image. A wide range of films played by her, especially the 1935 film entitled The New Woman, vividly interpreted this theme. Her tragic suicide in 1935 reinforced the popular discourse of the failed new woman. My critique of this discourse is that it is mainly based on the prescriptive side of gender being displayed on the screen. What has been overlooked is the performative aspect of gender being shaped through a dynamic interplay of women on screen and off screen. Therefore, I would like to propose the notion of the queer woman to conceptualize the performative side of women during these crucial times of gender transformation. I conceive queer not in terms of sexuality, but in terms of the gesture of defiance, aiming to undo restrictively normative conceptions of sexual and gendered life. My inspiration is from a 1928 film, Qi Nuzi, which I translate as A Queer Woman, produced by the film star Yan-fei. Through this case study, I unearthed the trope of the queer woman as an alternative gender identity in opposition to the male-defined new woman. I also argue that the queer woman functioned spatially across predefined national and gender boundaries. Now, let me briefly introduce Yan-fei. She was among the first generation of film actresses in China, rising to stardom in Shanghai in the mid-1920s. She was also the first Chinese woman who founded a film company. The Yan-fei Film Company was founded in 1928 and produced its only film, A Queer Woman, based on the true story about a woman's suicide. Yan-fei played the protagonist, umayyan. Shortly after the film's premiere in Shanghai, Yang took it to a screening and performance tour across Nanyang, which is Southeast Asia, under colonial rule at that time. So this paper presents a feminist reading of her gender performances in three areas: screen performance, stage performance, and social performance. In the first part, I ask how the gender identity of the queer woman came into being. The second part turns to Yang's Nanyang tour. So the first part, I provide a comparative reading of Yan-fei and her screen role, Yu Meiye, and I ask in what ways the queer woman is different from the new woman. Yan-fei was born in 1904, and Yu Meiye was 6 years older. Both were born into what may be called middle-class families in Shanghai and Guangdong. I will look at their gender performances in 4 acts. Act 1, both of them played the role of a girl student, which was a byproduct of China's social political reform in the early 20th century. Male intellectuals intended to create the girl student as an ideal new woman. But once she started to perform, she gained a certain agency and became the queer woman. Yang became a famous socialite, 交际花 in Chinese, in the Shanghai society. And Yu Meiyan was equally arresting because of her talent, outstanding looks, and the willingness to perform gender publicly. As time goes on, the girl student enters the second act, and she often plays a role known as Nora. Nora is almost a synonym for the new woman after she was introduced by Hu Shi in his translation of Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House in 1918. Afterwards, many Chinese Noras leave home, in fiction, on stage, on screen, and in the real world. Yang Naimei and Yu Meiyan were both Noras to a certain degree. Yang married to a businessman, but her husband went bankrupt after their marriage. Yang became a Nora at this point by divorcing her husband, allegedly because of his inability to afford her extravagant lifestyle. Yu Meiyan became a Nora in a more classical fashion. Under the patriarchal pressure, she married a wealthy man, but her husband then left for the US for business, leaving her alone in the oppressive Confucian family, which reminds me of the film The Curse of Guangkong. Eventually, Yu ran away from the marital family to pursue her own freedom. What happened after Noras had left home? How did Yang and Yu financially sustain themselves? They assumed the role of the femme fatale. The third new woman on the screen was often dramatized to be a prostitute, and the prostitute archetype was normally portrayed in a positive light as a handy symbol to expose the darkness of society by the male intellectuals. But the femme fatale figure earned much less sympathy, normally interpreted as a personification of the moral decline associated with Western modernity. The lesser-known stories of Yang Naimei and Yu Meiyan warrant rediscovery against this background. Yu was a typical femme fatale. After leaving home, she was seen in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and then started a round-the-world tour for 10 years, through Southeast Asia to Europe, Japan. She was warmly hosted anywhere she sojourned. A widely circulated rumor said that she had sexual liaisons with over 3,000 men. Yang Naimei's femme fatale status was a byproduct of the emerging star culture. Capitalizing on her sex appeal and celebrity status, she was said to have conquered numerous men, ranging from bankers, military leaders, provincial warlords, to businessmen. She established an image as a sexually liberated woman agent. Love and sexuality were pivotal to the discourse of women's emancipation in 1920s China, and the films that featured the prostitute character also capitalized on the subject of sex. However, for the prostitute created by male directors, sex is dirty and evil. But for the actual femme fatale or queer woman, sex is fascinating and even empowering. The last act I would like to explore is the phenomenon of the new woman commits suicide. The new woman's suicide was deployed in the modern press as a mirror for condemning social problems. Early Chinese film history is not short of such stories. A queer woman was one of them. However, if seen through the lens of gender performativity, more nuances will come to light. Why did Yu Meiyan commit suicide? Having seen the world, she often said, there would be no regret even if I died immediately. Yet, her passion was rekindled when she reunited with her first love, with whom she now desired to settle down. Unsurprisingly, she could not be accepted by the man's family. So afterwards, she converted herself to Buddhism But no peace was reserved for her even in the Buddhist temple because of her previous lovers and suitors' visits. So afterwards, after her banishment from the temple, she committed suicide on April 19th, 1928, drowning herself in the sea at age 30. This is the last photo she took. Press coverage of Yu's suicide attested to the complexity of the moral political territory of the Republican era. Cai Chushen, who would direct The New Woman 7 years later, framed Yu's suicide in the progressive new cultural rhetoric, fashioning her as the new woman, a fighter and a victim. He said, "What made her a queer woman, 奇女子 in Chinese, he used the exact term, was ultimately rooted in the old family system and evil society. Her fight against our dark society and her bravery and sacrifice should not be forgotten." But this is contradictory to her prevailing image as a scandalous femme fatale before her suicide. I argue that only when she died, she became a safe signifier for male intellectuals to invest any meanings they would like. But in reality, she is a queer woman defying any easy signification. A month after Yu's suicide, Yang Naimei announced her decision to found a film company and produce a film about Yu. She soon put together a strong production team with Shi Dongshan as the director, Cai Chushen as assistant director. And as you know, both of them later became preeminent left-wing film directors in the 1930s. People also said that Yang Naimei herself was likewise a queer woman who had been using acting to express her own suppressed feelings. To a certain extent, Yang was performing herself, or the queer woman at large. Yang's body and performativity would be further complicated when she displayed it on and off screen outside of China proper, which is the focus of my next section. Homi Bhabha argues that in-between spaces, or what he calls the interstices, are a crucial location for post-colonial critique. I argue that Nanyang functions as such an interstitial space to facilitate different gender performances of Yang Naimei. The Nanyang region in the early 20th century was unquestionably a community with competing claims because of its nature as European colonies and its large Chinese diaspora population. The Niger Market was crucial for the early Shanghai film industry. It consists of five regions based on the contemporary records. So it's the Straits settlement under British colonial rule, today's Singapore and Malaysia, and the Dutch settlement, chiefly Indonesia, the Philippines under American rule, Vietnam under French authority, and Thailand. Led by Shanghai film industrial leaders, from the mid-1920s on, Chinese film distribution and exhibition networks were growing rapidly across Nanyang. Apart from being a lucrative market, Nanyang also assumed an image as backward or uncivilized, other. For example, Zheng Junli wrote in 1936 that the Nanyang film industry was a colonial enterprise by nature under control of imperialist administrations. Shanghai films attracted a large number of Chinese immigrants, and most of them still led a medieval style of life attached to their homelands, and their worldviews were not very progressive. It was against this backdrop that Yan-fei embarked on her screening performance tour in Nanyang. During 3 years, she toured Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Penang, and cities in the Dutch colony. Her standard program includes screenings of A Queer Woman and other films, live performances, including traditional Chinese opera, exotic and erotic dances, and the Chinese Xingju or Huaju spoken drama, and singing. Taken together, what Yang's performative body exhibited here was not a homogeneous Chineseness, but an articulation of cultural differences. In so doing, she performed the unique subject, the queer woman, through negotiating with competing claims and discourses. In the following, I will investigate her strategies of representation and empowerment, formulated in her engagement with two intertwined themes, race and nation, gender and sexuality. So the first, race was a tricky matter for the Chinese diaspora in Nanyang. Despite their culturally and demographically strong presence, the Chinese diaspora was officially under Western colonial rule. Being a Chinese in Nanyang meant an intense engagement with competing powers and ambivalent relationship with hybrid ethnic identities. Yang's performative body intuitively addressed these issues. Her Cantonese opera performances addressed the problem of root, i.e. Chineseness. It was a pivotal dimension in the discourse of Huaqiao or overseas Chinese. But Yan-fei also exhibited the modern body of Chineseness in her Huaju spoken drama. The themes she selected appeared to be quintessentially May 4th, such as women's emancipation and modern marriage. Juxtaposed with this essentialized body of Chineseness was an exotic representation of sensual beauty offered in the so-called Paris wild dance, bringing vicarious pleasure one can expect in a Paris cabaret. Yang's body offered the Nanyang Chinese audience a comfortable domestic substitute for the alien European body associated with colonial power. Her performances of Latin American tango and Egyptian belly dance produced a slightly different type of gratification. These dances were appropriated from the colonized subjects, relishing Yang's reincarnation of the primitive body. The Nanyang Chinese derived a mimetic pleasure. So in short, Yang's strategies of empowerment rested in her capacity to dance with these complex power relations regarding race and identity in colonial Nanyang. Then let's have a look at the gender and the sexuality. At the heart of the queer woman's gender identity is their sexual deviance from both Confucian and May 4th norms of femininity. Nanyang afforded the queer woman with a stage to perform another dimension of sexual transgression, one that was interlinked with race. An unusual facet of umayyan's queerness was her cross-racial sexual activities. The press described Yu's sojourns abroad as animal-like amorous adventures, and the Nanyang audiences of the queer woman also depicted Yu as lustful and shameless. Racialized moral accusations are nothing new in patriarchal gender discourse. They often function as a psychological apparatus to legitimize forbidden desires. Taken together with Yan-fei's exotic dances, it is evident that racialized sexuality or sexualized race was what Yang intuitively produced to sell to her overseas Chinese audience as both attraction and abjection, allure and taboo. Through an accurate reading of the Huaqiao psyche of ambivalence, the queer woman empowered herself by fetishizing herself. The similar dynamic played out in Yang's off-screen, off-stage performance of her own sexuality. Not surprisingly, there was no shortage of moral accusation of Yang's eroticized dances. A more juicy subject was her relationship with a young man she claimed as sworn brother, Yi Di, but a tabloid journalist believed that he was simply her male concubine. Observing these performative acts of gender and sexuality, negotiating with the morality and the psychology of Nanyang community, it is clear that Yang epitomized the queer woman. When the new woman on the screen is discarded by men, devoid of financial means, and descends into the evil mire of prostitution and concubinage. The queer woman performs sexual emancipation, reverses gender roles, and subverts prescribed race and gender norms. This is what I read from the off-screen tales of Umayyan and Yang Naimei. Yang Naimei was not the only Shanghai star who assumed the queer woman identity. This case study provides a window through which we may envision a different gender identity, performing not only within China, but also beyond China. More research needs to be done to comprehend the cultural meanings of these border crossings and alternatives. Now, I'd like to quickly show some stills from the queer woman because the film is lost, not surprisingly, so only these stills are still available. Yeah, this is with the lover and she conversion to Buddhism. But last but not least, if I have 1 minute, I'd like to pose a question. Later, maybe we can discuss. That is the question of absence. So basically, the story I just presented was almost completely absent from the official history of Chinese cinema. The film, The Queer Woman, was even not included in the filmography, potentially the comprehensive filmography in the official history of Chinese cinema. So the question of absence, I like to quote Professor Gaines' question: why didn't we know, when she's talking about the earliest female producers in American film history in Pink Slipped? So she said, of course, this shows the unequal distribution of narrative wealth. We all know that. But then I also very much like this comment, that is, remarkably, the discovery of physical delvry with economic savvy in the case of those actresses who produced and sometimes directed now works as an antidote to the 1970s feminist analysis of erasure and victimization. So here, Professor Gaines is talking about 1970s feminist analysis. So in my case, actually, it is about the 1930s, the quasi-feminist analysis by male. I think this is a very interesting point of connectivity. Okay, that's from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Huang, for refreshing, new, comparative perspective to discuss the differences between the queer woman and the new woman. Thank you. Now let's welcome Professor Yongchun Fu from Ningbo Institute of Technology, Zhejiang University.
I'm sharing my screen now. Yan-fei.
Yes, yes, we
Okay,
can see
good.
you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the conference and this wonderful panel. I'm really flattered to join together with Xuelei, Huang, and Yan-fei. So my presentation today is
Excuse
TV.
me, Professor Fu.
Yeah.
I think you should put on the screen, the low button.
Yeah.
Okay now?
To enlarge the PowerPoint. It's on the right.
There,
corner.
yes. Oh, no.
Yes, 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 yes. It's right there. It's
Full screen.
Still now?
full screen.
I think I have two screens. That's the reason why it is kind of
Ah.
difficult. Okay. About this.
It's okay. So can you see the little there's
now?
a display.
Yay!
I can see it now.
Thank you, thank
Okay.
you.
Chilling in Chenta's territories. Chenta is a kind of a national animals for Burma. In 2007, I was a new PhD student at a university in China, preparing my thesis on American film censorship and rating systems. At that time, database was very limited to a Chinese student. As a fresh PhD student, I like to search any possible database with the keywords film censorship. It returned with 3 volumes of documents named the Film Censorship in India in a database. I didn't pay much attention on these documents, but I downloaded them with a sentiment of like everything. This document came to draw my attention more than 10 years later when I started to look at early Chinese cinema industry and its overseas market. As we know, Nanyang or Southeast Asia played a paramount role in China's overseas film market in the early 20th century. It is estimated that 40% of box office receipts come from Nanyang in the 1930s. There is a growing literature on the presence of Chinese films in Nanyang in the first half of the 20th century, a long forgotten period in Chinese film studies, as Dr. Huang just presented. In these limited numbers of literature, much spotlight is on Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. But it never occurred to me that there are some links between British India and China. Since my stereotype of India was a place dominated by Bollywood films and there's no room for Chinese films. Until I realized that Burma or Myanmar, the largest country in mainland Southeast Asia, or so-called Indo-Chinese Peninsula, was a province of British India in the 1920s. Therefore, I was much surprised to find that more than 60 films, including features and shorts, were recorded in those Indian film censorship documents. This article examines the presence of Chinese films in Burma in the 1920s through the lens of film censorship. As an initial step, I intended to answer several basic and fundamental questions, including which kind of Chinese films were introduced into Burma from 1925 to 1927, which kind of Chinese films were banned in Burma and why. Who went to watch Chinese films in Burma? The preliminary argument is that Burma is a rising and special overseas market for Chinese films in the 1920s. Chinese film audience in Burma are probably not low-class petty urbans or 小市民, such as shop clerks and workers, as suggested by literature. Cantonese and Fujianese served as traders and skilled craftsmen, together with some native Burmese, constitutes major audience for Chinese films. A preliminary study on the Chinese film market in Burma in the first half of the 20th century is yet to come. It is partly due to the language barrier and the scarcity of primary materials. Unlike other Southeast Asia countries, good Chinese films are carefully collected, digitalized, and accessed by elsewhere. Very limited old Chinese newspaper published in Burma has been kept due to the Second World War and the following anti-Chinese movement in post-war Myanmar. I hope to draw academic attention on these long-forgotten countries in a long-forgotten moment. The majority primary sources employed in this study is the collections of film censorship in India, located in the colonial office in the Great Britain. Collection include correspondence, conference minutes of India Boards of Film Censors, and the reports of the Indian Cinematograph Committee, 1927 to 1928. Second primary source is the Census of India, 1921 and 1931, respectively, published by Office of Census Operation. They include the detailed population census information on colonial Burma, distribution of Chinese population in each subdivisions, their arrange, and their occupations were well recorded in these documents. The film market in Burma. Before I proceeded further into the Chinese film market in Burma, a brief introduction of Burma in the 1920s will be helpful to our readers. Burma or Myanmar is a country located in Southeast Asia or Nanyang. It is bordered by India and China's Yunnan province and Thailand. Since 1886, all of Burma came under British rule and became a province of British India. Yangon was the capital and the largest city of British Burma. From 1937, Burma became a separated administrative colony of Great Britain before it declared to be an independent country in 1948. Contrary to the current image of poverty, colonial Burma is one of the most prosperous markets in British India. Burma before World War II was the largest exporter of rice, as well as exporter of oil and a variety of minerals, and it was known for just world's finest jade and rubies. Burma's earliest reference to film exhibition is back to 1908, where an Indian entrepreneur named Madden paid to expand his exhibition empire into Burma. As a province of British India, the film exhibition business in Burma is closely linked to its counterparts in the Indian subcontinent. In the 1927, there are 58 cinemas in Burma. And there is 10 main theaters in Yangon and 1 theater focusing on screen Chinese films only. Like Shanghai at that time, Yangon was home of Burma domestic film productions, locus of film distribution and exhibition, and the principal center of film exhibition. In most halls, Burmese, Indian, and Chinese films were shown occasionally, more or less successfully, depending on availability and popularity. The Chinese film market, the number of cinemas in India, Burma ranked as occupied 21% out of the total British Indian. Burma film market was second to Bombay. It's the second largest film market in British India. Chinese film market through the lens of the censorship. As an theoretically speaking, a certificate granted by any board of censor in British India is valid throughout British India. But in reality, provincial government holds rights to declare the film be deemed uncertified throughout the province. Chance is that one film is passed by one local board of censors while banned by another. So to Chinese film distributors, they would like to submit their films to the specific censor board instead of I submit censorship to Bombay, but I want to screen the films in Burma. It's not reasonable. In British India, there is rarely a market for Chinese films other than Burma in the 1920s. Film censorship documents recorded film examined in Bombay, Bengal, and Burma from 1925 to 1927. 1,631 films were examined in Bombay, and there is no one Chinese film. Screen is shared films examined in Bengal from 1925 to 1927. 6 out of 1,628 films. I identified the 2. One is Dr. Sun Yat-sen's funeral, and the other one is Crystal Shanghai. I'm not sure about the boy Harris, whether it's the famous Wu Erjiuji or not. There's the first film which I would like to draw the attention. It is written by, I think it's written by the India pronunciation, suggests that maybe it is a domestic Chinese film in productions instead of from mainland China. With regards to Burma, censorship records of Burma witnessed the steady rise of the Chinese film market. Reports of the Indian Cinematograph Committee contains that importation of Chinese films started from 1924. That year, 13 films was features and shorts were introduced into Burma's screen. Number reached to 32, 32 in 1925, 30 in 1926, and increased to 41 in 1927. From the lens of footage, we can see that starting from 1924, the footage of imported from China occupied around 11% and increased to 32% of total film footage examined in 1927. Possible explanation is the dramatic drop of foreign films submitted for censorship in Burma with unclear reasons. However, a steady rise of Chinese films in numbers is apparent. From April 1925 to March 1926, Burma Board of Censors examined 33 out of 164 Chinese films, including 17 shorts and 16 feature films. The shorts were a little bit overlapped with a fairy dance and sword dance, which is produced by China Sun or Minxin film motion pictures. Both produced by China Sun motion picture companies, formed by Meilan Fang. I'm still working on identifying these films. Currently, I identified 24 out of 33. Out of 33 films, 11 were produced by China Sun. 5 were produced by the commercial film press or 4 by Star Motion Picture Minxin, another 4 from Path Orange, 3 from Shanghai Motion Picture Shanghai Yingqi, and the other are from China Lilium, Dazhonghua Baihe. The list of Chinese films examined in Burma has significance in advancing study of early Chinese short films in general. All the 11 China Sun productions examined are short films. Censorship report recorded the length of the film. It helps to confirm and further detail the production information of China Sun, since the current literature only marked the roughly length of its shorts. In addition, there is a 703 feet short titled Demonstration of Power by the Women Suffrage Party in Canton. It's registered as China Sun production, while the existing literature is absent about this film. The Chinese name of these short films is open to further explanation. From 1926 to 1927, another 30 films were examined in Burma. The films examined witnessed the rise of feature films productions in China. There are 22 features and 8 short films applied for censorship. Minxin or China Sun contributed 3 shorts and 1 feature, Love is Dangerous, that is Yan-fei in Chinese. I identified 23 out of 30 films. Other than China Sun, there are 3 Minxin films, 3 Dazhonghua Baihe, 3 from Pacific Film, and 2 from light-hearted comedy. Apart from Shanghai companies, one Canton company named the China Diamond Film Company released a film, End of Jealousy, and one Tianjin company produced a long documentary-like film titled News and Sun of China. The distribution route of a Chinese film in Southeast Asia can be traced as well. Most of the films arrived in Burma from 1925 to 1927, after around 1 year later than their debuts in China. Like the films showing in Bengal, most of these films should be screened in Singapore first, before arriving in Burma. Therefore, it is very reasonable to see that Singapore is likely to be the locus distribution hub for China's Southeast Asia film market. In the 1920s, several companies such as Hongnan Film Company were organized to distribute Chinese films in Nanyang. These distribution companies granted screen rights from Chinese companies and circulated into other Southeast Asian countries after exhibiting in Singapore. Chinese film companies divided their distribution rights into three parts: British colonials, Dutch colonials, or Dutch East India. Now it's Indonesia, Vietnam, and now Thailand. British colonial, including British Myanmar, British Burma, and British Rojo. Most of these distribution companies either located or had branches in Singapore. A commercial published in a 1927 Singapore newspaper asserts that one company named Puzhi granted the screen rights of British and Dutch colonials for dozens of Chinese films. Diary of Lu Jie, a prominent producer of Great China Lilium, November 1928, Lu signed the screen rights of Dutch colonial with a distributor named Guo. On 13th September 1929, Lu sold a Vietnam screen rights of several films in his trip to Singapore. So although Burma since passed around 1,000 films during this period, very few were banned. With regards to Chinese films, there is only around 4 films was banned. The Life of Buddha, 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th one, actually, it was banned later. It's not during this period. And the last one is not banned per se. At the beginning, they banned it, but the Chinese film distributor later the controversial part, and then it passed. The 4 films banned, including which is appeared on the screen. Don't want to spend time to read it. So it is quite interesting that Story Night was banned in Burma. I think most of these films banned for the reason of the low moralities, because Story Night is talking about the issues with there's issues in the marriage and the fell in love with other people other than his wife. I think this is the most controversial part for the films and stands as a reason why it is banned in Burma. But any other reasons I still need to look at, because I haven't time to look at what's the actual reason behind that. But regarding to the Life of Buddha, produced by Unique Film Company, 天一电影公司, the Film Censorship Committee thought that the Burmans looked on the Buddhas as Burma instead of look like Chinese. The Rich Man's Daughter is actually the controversial part is their intertitles. He appears some concubine and the matrix in the intertitles. And as I said, the Chinese distributors remove this part. The next part I'm spend maybe quite quickly talking about the possible audience, film audience for Chinese films in Burma. There's only 4 points I would like to address. One is Burma saw a rise of a Chinese population from 1921 to 1931. Population increased from 0.1 million, 0.149 million to 0.9 million. Amount of Chinese population is similar with that in Auckland, 2013, where I'm currently living. The increase of popularity provided the potential market for Chinese films. The second point I would like to address is most of the Chinese lived in 3 subdivisions of Burma, which is literally its northern Shan states, and the center parts as well as the Delta subdivision, including capital at the largest city, Yangon. Northern Shan State, the Northern Shan State, Chinese in the Northern Shan State are mostly Yunnanese because it's close to Yunnan, and living in the rural areas, and many of them are cultivating owners, particularly in the rice industry. They are hardly audience for Chinese films. And Cantonese and the Fujianese has increased by 36,000 or 50% from 1921 to 1931. This increase is largely, if not entirely, due to migration. 68% of the Chinese, other than Yunnanese, lived in the Delta subdivision. There are 30,000 Chinese living in Yangon, represent 70.5% of the total population. Among the Chinese, there is a slightly more than one female for every 2 males. They are the potential audience for Chinese films. In comparison, the second largest city in Burma, Mandalay city, only has 2,000, more than 2,000, slightly more than 2,000 Chinese. And the literary is another issue. It is surprisingly to notice that in Yangon, in Yangon in the 1931, I think 60% of male can read and write at least one language. It is a quite significant number. With regards to Chinese, I think it's around 35.6% of Chinese living in Yangon and speak or write at least one language. Another thing is the occupation structure for male Chinese earners. This is the national. This is the provincial of Burma's statistic. We can look at the traders and the shop assistants occupied 41%, and craftsmen occupied 14%. Actually, the figures in Yangon will be much higher than this one. And the unskilled and the semi-skilled laborers may be limited to around 7%. So unlikely Zheng Junli's statement in general about the Nanyang's film audience, they are all petty urbans, they are job workers or living in a kind of old styles. I think possibly audience in Chinese film audience living in Burma, which is quite different with other parts of the Southeast Asia countries. This is another reason why, as we go back to look at the films which was introduced in Burma, there are seldom martial arts films screened in Burma. Actually, that's quite interesting things. And I think this is a quite interesting one we need to further explore. I would like to conclude with one thing to think about it. What's the significance of Burma film market to Chinese film studies? It is not only a diaspora film market for Chinese film studies, but I think explanations of Burma film market and their film censorship maybe help us to present a transnational perspective to look at Chinese film and think about in which way Burma's film censorship can impact Chinese domestic film productions, and also maybe the study of Burma film censorship records can help us, like what we can have a further understanding about the early Chinese film shorts, especially the Mingxin's one. Of course, there's another things which we can do to think about it distribution routes or other parts of Burma, but it's quite initial steps for this unforgotten field. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hu. Thank you for impressive presentation. We learned a lot about the censorship and Chinese film distribution in Burma. So we're now in the discussion session, and I have one question for Professor Huang and one question for Professor Fu. So Professor Huang, since you were talking about Yang Naimei's film and their distribution in Nanyang, so I wonder if Yang had plans for her film to distribute in Nanyang, and is it related to, since you said that the queer woman has a kind of gender performance, like very open style more open style than the New Woman. So I wonder if the kind of gender performance is related to the film distribution plan in Nanyang. That's my question. And yeah, is it a strategy to win the heart of people in Nanyang? And my question for Professor Hu would be, so you were talking about films distributed in Burma, and like the close relationship with Singapore, like some countries in the Southern Asia. My question would be how they were distributed. Like, is there any institution, like professional institution, for them to distribute these films from various film companies to distribute these films to other countries, including Burma, in the 1920s? That's my question.
Okay, thank you very much, Yan-fei, for these questions. And yeah, and in terms of whether Yang had planned to distribute to the queer woman in Nanyang, I think yes, because at that time, as Professor Fu also showed, the connection between the Shanghai film industry and the Nanyang market was closer than we thought. And especially at that time, actually, Yang Naimei and other actresses like Wang Kanlun and someone else also performed in Nanyang. So they had very close relationships with the Nanyang distributors. Why Yang Naimei showed the queer woman to sing to Nanyang, because she said she was invited by someone in Singapore, a distributor. That's why she went there, and then the trip, it turned out to be the 3 years, because relating to Professor Fu's presentation, that is because the whole distribution network. Actually, I wonder whether she also went to Burma. It's highly likely, although it's always, as early film historians, it's really difficult to trace these things. I don't have all the sources. I mainly use the Singapore newspaper, Singapore sources. So they only show these, but I'm clearly it's not a full story. Yeah, so that is then whether, in terms of your question, whether her gender performances or what you called it's more bold gender performances related to the plan to show to the Nanyang audience. I don't think so. Going back again to Professor Fu's article, you see the films that were censored in Burma, actually they passed in Shanghai without any problem. At that time, Shanghai actually was more progressive in terms of, or less conservative on these issues. So I don't think, I think it is mainly because she was inspired by umayyan. The people also said that actually she and umayyan were friends, which I'm not sure. You know, these tabloid newspapers, I only use these sources as representation, as the stories they wanted to show, but I can't say that they always tell the truth. But anyway, it is because she was inspired by Yumayyan's story and she really wanted to make this film as a grassroots feminist initiative, I would say. I'm sure she doesn't have all these feminist theories or even the awareness. I think it's some sort of awareness and consciousness, but I'm sure she doesn't have to make it as some overt manifesto. But what she did is, yeah, so I don't think it is a strategy related to Nanyang, but Nanyang just provides a very interesting platform for her to perform, especially these real performance. I was really blown away by the program that mixes all sorts of Chinese, Cantonese opera. I saw Louisa Wei's documentary film. It's about the Cantonese opera in Brazil, right? In South America. I haven't watched the documentary film, but I wonder whether there is any connection, you know. But Cantonese opera, that's not surprising. Lots of immigrants living in Nanyang from Canton, and at the same time, she also showed these so-called Paris wild dance and the tango and the Egyptian ballet. This really shows how she intuitively played with all sorts of powers, if we like, to make her own voice heard, one way or another. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Regarding to Yan-fei's questions, I think do have several film companies organized in Singapore. One is named Dongnan Film Company, which was responsible for distributing Crystal Shanghai in Gale in British India. And there is another film company named Pu. The commercial in 1927, I think they granted several, I think maybe more than 12 films, Chinese films for their green right in British colonials and the Dutch colonials. They all have branches. I think they all have branches, or at least representatives in Shanghai. And actually, the relationship between distributors, kind of distributors and producers, is quite complicated. I'm not sure whether I still can share my screen, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, I show you. This is Lu Jie's diary. So in the 1926, October 28, Lu Jie has a meal with a representative named Wang Yuting, which is a Nanyang film company located in Singapore. They have a meal together, and Wang planned to actually invest his film production named the Mei Ren Ji, and with the condition is screenwriter for British and Dutch colonial rights should give it to Nanyang Film Company. So they invest their film productions and they get distribution rights in some cases. They do have a lot of such kind of things in Lucia's diary. This is one thing I would like to address. With regarding to another thing, with regarding to the other questions in the dialogue, I think someone asked to what extent can language influence distribution and screening in Burma. It's quite interesting because Burma, it's quite surprising to know that Burma has various language existing that in the 1920s. So for Chinese films, if it is want to screen to other entities, you need to intertitles at least 3, I think. Burmese, Indian, Hindi language, English, and if they want to add the Chinese language, Chinese characters as well. So it's really hard for them to, it's really hard for Chinese films to show to other ethnicities, but some domestic Burmese do like to watch them because I think Chinese and the Burmese share the kind of morality preference, and that they do share the common religious Buddhism. That's another things which is addressed by several scholars already.
Yes, Professor Gens.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something coming from the chat more specifically, but then first, before I get to the specific, broaden the difficulty of the new woman question with Professor Huang, and then I'm going to carry this over into the question about the population that Professor Fu brings up relative to the overseas Chinese, because it would seem to me, number one, that this is like the research that Yan-fei will share with us on Chinatowns, that these films go where there's a Chinese community. That just seems to pop out. And I'm speaking here for those learning Chinese film history. That's my job here, is to represent sort of the audience coming new to the topic. So I wanted to segue from that question of the Chinese overseas audiences, which seems pretty much easy to establish, to the complicated question of what, Xuelei, you say is the new woman understood as a male phenomenon. And I'm thinking here of the Modern Girl Around the World project. You're aware of that project. What always struck me about it is how scholars who had studied these countries for so many decades suddenly said, and we hadn't thought there might be a sociological phenomenon. Well, here's my difficult question. When we start speaking about motion pictures in the sociological context, then there's always the question of who is the audience. And we would assume with the new woman, it's an urban audience, which immediately made me think about the constitution of the Burmese audience. Rangoon is not even the largest enclave for overseas Chinese. And Rangoon is I assume it's a major city. Shanghai, of course, my concern here always about the new woman, the goddess being the example that we get over and over, those of us just learning Chinese film history, is that this doesn't represent the enormity of women in China. And so, number one, there's that dilemma with the new woman is not exactly representative. She may be a myth, but then you're complicating the question with the queer woman, which is going to be very exciting once we get your work into circulation and can talk about it, because that's a question of the for whom, that the queer woman who's a step in advance, I would argue. The queer woman would seem to be, what percentage is it? And imagine, what percentage of women had this capacity to name her company after herself. And we found in doing research on women, historically beginning industries, they name their companies. They're the producers. They give them their first and their last name. So she's claiming a lot. She's self-sufficient. She's sexually liberated, but she isn't exactly representative. This is not to complain. It's just to say that we have a very interesting theoretical problem here. To shift this to Professor Wu, if the queer woman did circulate in, well, we know Nanjing more likely, but Burma, this is an all male audience. What did they do with an image, let's say the queer woman, which is going to be one of our favorite canonical lost titles, I can tell. What happens with such a small percentage of women? Then the queer woman get claimed the way the new woman has probably, I think you may be right here, claimed for men on behalf of men, when the early idea, as you know, was that feminists claimed the new woman. And you're arguing, come back to my key point here, Xuelei, you're arguing differently, that it's a contrast that makes us rethink the construct new woman, especially in the case of Shanghai. So that's really two questions addressed, the male-female audience relative to that complicated sexuality, and then the new woman theory.
Yeah, thank you very much for the response. And I think the sociological question, it is very much at the core of all our studies of these, cinema, and they are not representative at all, of course. And then no matter new woman or queer woman, but actually I would like to argue that they did make a bigger impact, because like today, all the materials I present are from the print press. So these materials were circulated more widely than we probably thought. The crime magazines and also the major metropolitan newspapers, they were circulated quite widely. And from these sources, they get these ideas of what all these juicy subjects about what Yan-fei, the queer woman, did, and not to say the films. I think the print press, the circulation is wider than films, because the films obviously need more electricity and all sorts of things. So I agree, definitely they are not representative, but the grassroots feminist awareness, consciousness were circulating through these channels. That's the queer woman's contribution to the history of Chinese woman feminism, or so that's what I am thinking.
And a comment here before we go to Professor Fu, because I'm always struck by how many times we have to remind our contemporary Chinese students of how many times there has been strong feminism in the history of China. And we keep losing that thread. I'm just arguing from the point of view of trying to teach about it. We don't want to lose that, so you're bringing it back again. And before we go to Professor Fu, Louisa Wei wanted to know about the studio that Naimei would have used. Did she use the Mingxing or the Star Studio? No. And you're the world expert on the Mingxing studio.
This is definitely her own company, film company, and the fund was, rumor goes that she went to visit a Shandong warlord. Then after banquet and whatever, then she got the money to. This is always the circulating rumor, but it's not definitely.
She used a facility. No
facility. No, I don't think so.
She can.
It's possible she can hire something, but because it is funded by her own fund, and as you can see from the photo I showed, she is the one who is standing very much in the middle. It's not the male director Shi Dongshan and the others. She's the very one. She's the boss. So I don't think she can hire something. but definitely it's our own company.
Professor Fu's nodding. You have another question about martial arts too. You saw.
I think Bobby Huang asked another question. I'll ask Bobby Huang's question first. I'm not sure, because I didn't access any old Burma Chinese newspaper. That's one major limited for this research, because actually I cannot find it, honestly. I look at all around Australian, Singapore library and the database. There's no old Chinese newspaper in Burma existed, honestly. So I don't know. So still there's no screen records for like advertisement and the screen records published in newspaper. I cannot access this one. So I don't know about this one. I try to search the India Times, which is a English newspaper published in British India, but there's no information regarding to Burma's Chinese film exhibition. So I don't know whether there's a benches or not, honestly. It is a quite initial preliminary study on Burma. And to me, I cannot speak Burma, so another limitation. Second question is, I didn't see there's only one kind of films released in Burma. I also see there's so far, as far as the record shows, there's no martial arts films was circulated into Burma. I don't know, I haven't gone back to the details about which kind of films with the film content or film genres regarding to the films circulated in Burma. But it is interesting to notice that actually Tianyi, especially Tianyi, who produced the martial arts films a lot and the customers films a lot. Actually, there's only one or no films distributed into Burma, although a film has a strong connections with Nanyang film market and specialized in there. Still cannot answer this question, but I don't think there's only one kind of films growing in Burma. Okay.
May I add a question for to Professor Fu? That is, so are these censors British censors or local censors? Because based on the films that were censored, it struck me really they are quite conservative in a way. So.
There are 8 members in Census of Board in Burma, and I think there's 4 British citizens, 3, one is the municipal, I think, councillor or something like that, 1 woman, and 3 Burma natives. Something's back to my materials later, but it's not all British citizens. I do have a question to ask Ms. Huang regarding to her replies about whether Yan-fei owned the studios or not. Sometimes the photos do not explain a lot or cannot explain all, in particular in China's magazines, because like the Asiatic Film Company, which you write a fantastic article. We all see that Zhang Shichuan standing in the middle and direct everything or not, but my research showed that actually the cinematographer or photographer was named William Lynch. He didn't appear in the photo, but he's the person who in charge of the cinematic camera movement, all the things. Although, like Zhang Shichuan admitted that his film knowledge is next to nothing when he involved into film production. So photos not always the right way to explain everything.
Yeah, of course. And all these materials, if we use the post-modern way of thinking, these are all representations. So where's the truth? But in terms of the specific question of whether Yang Naimei, I think, founded the film company, I think that is pretty much sure, because
Yeah, I
it's
agree
not
with you
only
this
about this photo. Yeah, there are lots of sources you can cross-reference, so that's not a question. But yeah, I fully agree with you. Photos, they have always particular motivations to show particular photos. And I do see a question about in the chat box from Jim.
Yes, from Jim Chang. Oh, let's answer
Yes.
this one, Julie.
Yeah, do we have time? All right.
Oh, yes,
So-
we've got about 8 more minutes. Please
Okay.
answer this question and read it for the people who might have missed it.
Yang actually, she had a quite tragic later life. She eventually married to a man from Guangdong, and it's from a quite prestigious family. But somehow then she went to Hong Kong, and she later, the last few years, she became a beggar, which again, going back to Professor Fu's, this is all from this tabloid newspaper who are still curious about this woman, actress. So then they described her as begging in Hong Kong street, and but why then? Yeah, really, I don't know. Then she has a daughter in the first marriage, I think. And her daughter was living in Taiwan. Then when her daughter saw the news on newspaper, she picked her from Hong Kong to Taiwan, but she passed away quite shortly in Taiwan. This also, begs all sorts of questions, the mother-daughter relationship, or being a daughter to such a queer woman. This is the question. Although she actually took her daughter to Nanyang, the whole Nanyang tour with her daughter and her sisters. It's not
As
only
a child?
As a child, yes. Her daughter sometimes also performed on stage. Yeah, this is my paper didn't cover that part, but it is. And she also, on the Shanghai newspaper at that time, she always want to highlight her image also as a mother. It's the queer woman has lots of dimensions. It's not just like a sexual liberated woman. She also has this more traditional side, being a mother. But then in terms of your particular question about, I don't really know. More research needs to be done.
Well, it's good we get this question from Jim Chang, who's an expert on Taiwanese cinema. And so we'll keep digging. This is a terribly important new figure you've excavated for us. And I wanted to say about this panel, it comes to us from Beijing, China, Auckland, New Zealand, and Edinburgh, Scotland.